everybody. Welcome back to the JPU Show, a podcast for full-time podcasters and aspiring full-time podcasters who want to level up their game, avoid burnout, and maybe make a little money in the industry. My name is Badr. I'm one of your hosts, and I've got the amazing, incredible, smart, beautiful, stupendous Blythe Brumley. Happy Friday. We're recording on a Friday. I guess I should state that. Happy Friday. How was your pod week? I don't know, just trying something new. Trying something new for the intros. How was your week in podcasting? How many podcasts did you do this week? You do a lot of podcasts.
Just one this week. No, yeah, just one this week. I have 4 next week, though.
Wow. I'm over here stressing out about 2 in the same week, and you've got 4. Like, it's an easy layup.
Well, no, there is obviously prep involved, but then you still want to think about it. I'm trying to get better about just active listening instead of over preparing for shows. And I think that that's key on a week like where you have a bunch of different interviews lined up, is just to embrace the curiosity aspect and genuinely listen to what people say and be able to listen to that, but then also craft a question, a follow-up question, or a new question based on how they answer.
Yeah, I'm not very good at doing that on the fly. I've told myself many times, many weeks, where I'm like, okay, just an outline, Badr, not a novel. Outline, not a novel. But I don't know, I kind of like writing out my show notes and organizing them in a way and making little notes here and there. But I do agree, that is something I'm trying to do better at, is being in the moment, being on the fly with some of the questions. And I think I've struck a good balance. But what I need to do better at is not having like an outline for a safety net at all.
I think having an outline is fine. It's the thousands of words added to the outline. An outline is it should be small. It should be, I've heard YouTubers say, don't start a YouTube video with an entire script. Just use 2 or 3 bullet points, and you should be able to talk on those 2 or 3 bullet points. Unless you're bringing like stats and things like that, you really, it should be a practice to try active listening and have a general, do your research, read up on the person, of course, listen to other shows and do things like that. But you never, I was right there with you until there was one time that I very actively was prepping for shows, and I was prepping at the last minute, and I said, okay, I'm going to prep for this one right now that's coming up at noon, and then I'm going to prep for the one at 3 immediately after. Well, I actually prepped for the wrong one, and I joined the conversation with the guest thinking that it was going to be the one I was going to be prepping for later on, and I had no questions. And so it ended up being a really great conversation, and that was the nudge I needed, that I can be okay with having a conversation with someone. And I think that's the art of podcast, is that you're going to have a general framework of what you want to talk about, but then you allow the conversation to sort of go in these different directions, and allowing yourself the freedom and ability to have a conversation with someone and be able to bring it back on topic when it needs to be. Like, obviously that's something that takes a while to learn and even trust yourself. But I learned the hard way that it's okay to not prepare and just practice active listening.
I think I do less prep, or I adhere less to, I guess I'm just more relaxed recording when it's like a co-host situation. When I do certain episodes where I'm just recapping, like, this month in comics, and we're just picking like various topics and everyone's bringing something to the table. Those are fun because you don't have to prep so much. You can rely on other people, and you're just kind of inserting your opinion and reactions to the news. But I feel like with interviews, that's where it's still a learning curve for me to try to be a little more go with the flow, conversational. And I've been studying like other interviewers and trying to like walk that fine line of casual, conversational, like, to make it feel like we're friends just chatting, but also like respecting their time and hitting certain points. I went ahead and pulled up just a random show note that I've got, and I'm just curious, like, what's the word count? And for this one, this is not the longest one I've ever done. This was just a recent one where we recap some headlines and news, and it comes out to 1,453 words. If you would have told me in high school that I could write 1,000-word essay or just show no outline, I don't know if I'd believe it. Because remember back in the day, a teacher would tell you 1,000 words. You'd be like, do they want me to write a book? Are they crazy? Now with my outlines, it's like nothing. I got this.
Well, I think it helps too with what you're with helping your own brain process of how you're going to frame the conversation and different points, because that always helped me in my sports days when I would I would have notes app open on my phone. I would have ways to store different information, articles, links, things like that. But all of that information helps you, not necessarily in that particular show, but it will help you shows down the line that you may be recording. It just helps with I think organizing your thoughts and also memory retention of whatever you're going to discuss. So you can clearly tell, I think in some podcasts when someone is reading from a script versus when they just have to go to something to read it, like a stat or a quote or things like that. I think that there's definitely a big difference in having the I guess the interview supported by research, which really was what show notes are, versus just having a script that if the person goes off, if you miss one question or something and you have to go back and ask it, even though it's completely unrelated to what that person just answered or the conversation you're talking about at that particular point. I think that that's when you run into issues of you have to be able to balance the prep work and the research side of things with being able to ad lib and skip around a little bit based on what the answers your guest is giving you.
Well said. And I feel like you perfectly, not only did you state that perfectly, but you gave me such a good alley-oop to our first topic of the day, which let's lead with your topic. You brought this one to the table. You wanted to discuss it. It is sports related, and sports radio related as well. So what do you got for us today? What's our first topic?
So the way I kind of want to position this one is, have you yourself, have you ever been approached by someone, maybe a podcast network owner or something like that, but somebody's starting up a podcast network, or maybe they already have one established and they want you and your podcast to join their network? Have you ever had that conversation?
Yeah, I've been solicited a few times for networks, and I still get them to this day. Sometimes they're a little hard to, tell if it's a spam email, if how serious they are. But I'll be honest with you, I think I just have no interest in joining a network. So I just kind of overlook those emails, to be honest.
Well, I think that is the smart approach, but for a lot of podcasters and just bloggers, content creators in general, this is a very hard thing to turn down. And this news just came out recently where SB Nation Podcast Network shuts down completely. Now, SB Nation is, for folks who may not be aware, they are a major conglomerate in the world of sports. They were owned by Vox. I believe they started up as independent. And basically what they do is they start off with one or two teams. So maybe they have and when I say teams, I really mean cities. So maybe like a New York, a Chicago, all the bigger, Pittsburgh, bigger sports cities. Atlanta is another one that comes to mind. LA, where they have multiple pro sports teams. And what happens is that you have these content creators that are making content locally in those cities. Then they join up into a big network, and then that big network forms. And then they start finding other sports cities to find those other content creators in those cities to join that network. That's essentially how SB Nation was started. Vox Media, I believe, bought them out years ago. Well, now Vox Media is facing their own just legacy media in general. Media companies that have been around for 10 plus years, maybe 20 years even, are facing a lot of financial difficulties because the money is running out. And the way that they cover sports, the way that they cover their respective genres is the business model is failing. And they don't have the revenue to justify essentially paying for all of these creators and giving them an ad share, giving them ad revenue, and being able to support the editors and the other. It's really only editors, but when I say editors, I mean copy editors, I mean podcast editors, video editors. So they really don't have the revenue to justify paying those salaries anymore. So unfortunately, this is, we're talking about SB Nation. They lost several podcasts about a year ago, and then this week, what happened with the news is that the rest of them are no longer going to exist. And so it's sort of the downfall of sort of the local sports media, but they were a network. And I had a lot of familiarity with this, especially, the company that released this article, Awful Announcing. They were part of the same blog network that I was a part of back in my blogging days. So I was part of a blogging network very similar to podcast networks. And now for folks who may not know, a podcast network is essentially going to be a platform that is going to follow the very similar model to SB Nation, but they're going to bring in a bunch of different podcasts. They could cover a variety of topics. They're going to bring you under one brand, one umbrella, and they're going to sell the value of that network to a variety of advertisers. And then those advertisers are then going to give permission or pay, obviously, to pay that network to make all of the podcasters under that particular platform use their advertising. And so it's basically like a rev share model where you have everybody kind of, it's the power of everyone together and everyone's analytics and topics, but you have to split all of that revenue with everybody else on the platform, probably based on a percentage of your audience relative to other podcasters on that same network. Well, that is shutting all down. Awful Announcing, formerly part of the Blogging Network, which I used to be part of and left because I never got paid a dime. But it's one of those situations where it really brings to light of all of the infrastructure that exists within, I think, a lot of legacy media and a lot of whenever new content channels come around, and how they can monetize them the best, where they have all of these different social media channels, maybe that all tie in. So say, if you have a local sports podcast that's part of SB Nation, so Big Cat Country here locally was the gem as far as independent sports coverage that's separate from the team. And I say separate from the team because they can, if you're independent, you can tend to talk about, you can tend to, mention things, have a grander opinion on different topics of what the team is doing, separate from what the team and the team media's department is going to give you. So you have all these creators, you have all these podcasters that spent years and years building up their audience on all of these different. So if you have the podcast and you have a Twitter, you have YouTube, you have an Instagram, you have obviously the podcast, you probably maybe have a newsletter. So you have all of these different channels that you've spent years building up. And then when a company like SB Nation decides to pull the plug on it, you're left with nothing. And I think that this is the reason why I wanted to bring up this topic, is because SB Nation is not alone. There are several other different companies that are facing this same issue, albeit not at the same scale as SB Nation. But then there was one person, Kyle Scott Lakowski, on X, that he seems to have some loose affiliation, prior affiliation with SB Nation. And he had this whole Twitter thread of the problems with local sports podcasts and why this particular, or this example, does not work, and how podcast networks as a whole don't work. So the reason I wanted to bring this topic up is because for a lot of our audience that may be listening, they will likely be approached at some point to join a network. And I wanted to lay out the pros and cons of it, especially when you see a platform like this that arguably was set up for success. Why did they fail? And what are the lessons that we can learn from it? And so I guess, all that to say, I feel like I've been talking for a minute. Any questions, any insight before I run into some of these problems that that Kyle is going to lay out for us with the problem of local sports podcasting that could hint as to why SB Nation failed?
I think the piece from the article talking about SB Nation shutting down that triggered me the most is it seemed like a recurring kind of statement or expression that was in the article from all of these podcasters that are part of this is like, this has blindsided us. Like I tried to upload an episode, I don't have access to the RSS feed. Like as two people that have been podcasting for 10 going on 12, 13 years now, how I guess it showed me the value of ownership and having ownership to your RSS feed. Because when you think of podcasting, like, yeah, you own the show, the way it looks. You run, you run the show. You probably run a social account for it. But what is the tangible thing that you own in podcasting? And I think it's safe to say like your RSS feed might be the most valuable thing you own as a podcaster. So I found that a little interesting. That well, I guess not interesting, but maybe just reiterating that is one of the things that you might have to give up joining a network, is that autonomy as well as like ownership to your RSS feed. Now, the RSS feed isn't a tangible thing you can hold and store in your pocket, but it's the lifeblood of your. I mean, it is your podcast. So to read a bunch of quotes from podcasters who all of a sudden, wake up and their show is not online, or they can't access their dashboard or upload an episode is, I think it's like a podcaster's worst nightmare, right? I mean, there's plenty to, real life stuff to be concerned about, but in this context, like that is probably like a podcaster's worst nightmare. Wake up and their show is gone, no access to it. Like this is something that you put time and effort and resources towards, and to just have no reason, because I couldn't find any official reason why I see SB Nation and my mind goes to Shortbox Nation. So when you sent me this article, I was like, wait, is my podcast shutting down and I didn't know about it? I couldn't find a reason why, and I think that's definitely. I mean, Kyle Scott, how do you say it, Laskowski, on X laid out some pretty compelling reasons why. I think his thread was a little more catered towards like local sports podcasting. And I mean, I read through the thread, and I think there's a lot of things that apply to just podcasting in general. And I think for the most part, according to his thread, it kind of comes down to the amount of effort to run a network and make significant revenue from it, and then having to split that, it's just like it's more effort than makes sense. Is that kind of the gist of what you got out of his post?
Kind of. I can run through, a few of them here. And so he listed 5 problems with local sports podcast. And keep in mind that these, even though they're local sports podcasts, typically, to your point, these creators have their own social media channels, not their own, sort of Twitter account or Instagram, or, your own personal account tied to your name. It's specifically around the brand that so I'll go back to the Big Cat Country example. They have an Instagram account that's for Big Cat Country, a Twitter account that's for Big Cat Country, and then various different writers would put that in their bio, and some of them were paid. I don't know the specifics of it, so I won't comment on in that regard, but it's very rare to make a full-time income from a company like SB Nation, unless you are extremely valuable, you have editorial experience, and typically that was 1, maybe 2 people that were getting paid full-time income. When I say full-time income, I mean, I don't know the specifics, but if I had to guess, I would say around 40 to 50,000 a year. But you are working nonstop. The rest of these people that are, also contributing, they are expected to contribute several articles every single week. Episodes, especially if it's a football podcast, you're expected to probably at least drop a pregame preview, sometime before the next game, a post-game recap. So that's 2 episodes a week at the height of football season. So there's a lot of expectations that are involved when you're part of these big conglomerate networks. And a lot of these philosophies, there are a lot of like other copycat networks. They're not copycat networks, but there are other networks that are trying to they see this going on and they're trying to do the same thing. So I'll go into the pros and cons here in a minute, but specific to local sports podcasts, Kyle goes on to list, 5 different problems, and he says one, that there's too many of them. So for Jacksonville, for example, we have SB Nation. I believe USA Today had their own specific Jaguars focused content arm. Then there's also Sports Illustrated, which Sports Illustrated and I believe USA Today eventually did join, so that they became a conglomerate. Then there's also like a Locked On Jaguars. There's several other different local podcasts. And then you have those as like part of networks. Then you have your local radio and TV. And then look at podcasters and bloggers as like the bane of their existence. That thankfully has changed. But yeah, I could tell stories about how I was personally treated as a blogger, as a podcaster who did not take the traditional route of going to broadcasting school or journalism school or anything like that. So you're almost an outsider within the outsiders, even if you still cover the team. And then in addition to those two groups, you have the truly independent podcasters who have their own channels that they own. They're not necessarily part of another network. And if they were part of a network, they still own their content. So basically what he is saying is that there's too many of them. And I would disagree slightly here, because I think for a lot of the local sports podcasts, it is very demanding. You don't get a lot of pay, and therefore you're not keeping up regularly with a publishing schedule as, say, somebody that has a daily radio show is going to be obviously focused heavily on that particular team, that particular city, and the rest of, what's going on. So I would disagree a little slightly there, only because you can have so many of them, but how many of them are actually actively publishing?
This is no dig to our Jax podcaster family, but do you remember the first... just go to our first meetup, which, by the way, this month, I think actually today might have been the 6-year anniversary for the record.
Oh,
yeah, I think it was like April 15th or 18th when we threw our first JPU meetup. So
tax day?
I don't remember. I think it's like the 15th or 18th. But do you remember how many sports, and I think it's just safe to say Jaguar podcasters that we met at that first and second meetup?
Probably
where it was
half
like,
a dozen.
Yeah, like it was, I remember thinking like, oh my God, there's you guys, and then there's, countless, Jaguar not podcasts, but radio shows as well. I'm like, man, who's listening to all of this? And I think that actually goes into one of the other reasons that he's got here is that, it's just, people that listen to local sports radio is much smaller than you would think. When you compare it to podcasts about finance or tech or sales, which is a little more, I guess, scalable. You could scale that. There's, way more. The audience size is much larger than, say, like someone that is listening to, as a Jaguar fan, Well,
I think so that was one of his answers, or one of the other reasons, or one of the 5 problems, is that he basically said that it's impossible. Well, I'll go through them really quick. So the first one was there's too many of them. The second reason is even when bundled together, local sports podcasts don't work. The third one is it's impossible to sell ads. I disagree there. The fourth one is radio and TV aren't dead, which is signals to your point. And then the fifth one is podcasts still don't plug into the internet pipes that well. Now, going back to the radio and TV aren't dead, I would list that as yet. They're not dead yet. However, they have an extreme convenience factor where you can just turn on the radio, or you get in your car and you turn on the car and the radio just turns on. Mm-hmm. For a lot of people who, especially older demographics, that is very important. Almost very similar to TV. You turn on the TV and it just works. You don't have to load up a streaming app. You don't have to search for a podcast app on your phone. It's already, the distribution is already built in. And you have people that this is their job. This is their full-time job in order to cover this team. Whereas podcasters, it's your part-time job. You're keeping up with, a lot of the new, you're not necessarily, local radio talent in the modern day is not necessarily breaking news either, because the whole model has been just changed. And the reason that they're not breaking news is because players now have a direct relationship with their audience through social media and through their agents. And so their agents, and using social media channels, they're dropping the news directly. Whereas 20, 30 years ago, the sports reporting back in the day, the way that they would break news is the reporters would have that close relationship with the players. They would go and have drinks with them. They would sit with them for hours in the locker room and develop those trusting relationships with them, so that player or that coach or the person, working for the team that's disgruntled or whatever, they feel that connection to them, and they know that that reporter or that journalist broadcaster is going to respect their anonymity if requested, and that's how news used to break. That model doesn't exist anymore. Well, it kind of exists. I still think trust is very important with the audience, but the point is that the players and the coaches and even staff can be anonymous. They can go direct through social media, or a lot of the times, 9 times out of 10, they're sending that information to their agents, and their agents have relationships with the Adam Schefters of the world and the people who are responsible for breaking news. The one that I didn't agree with on this list is that it's impossible to sell local ads. Now, the reason why I vehemently disagree with this is because if I have a local podcast and I am listening to local sports radio, 99% of the time, that local radio station is going to have their local ads that appear during the typical commercial breaks. You talk about a topic for about 12 minutes, then you go to commercial break for 6, you come back for 12 more minutes. And so it's really easy to sell those 30 seconds to 1 minute ad slots for that time. In addition to those ad slots, you now have podcast advertising. And so that's an additional fee that sales teams that work at radio stations are now selling. And so if I am a local podcaster, or if I specifically, it doesn't even have to be specifically sports, I am paying attention to whoever the companies are that are advertising on the podcast players. And a lot of times those packages are treated separately. So that's one that I disagreed with, because Kyle is coming at it from the lens of a VC, a venture capital funded company. What they're going to do, they're going to sell ads as a conglomerate. They're going to sell ads as a group. They're going to mostly be dealt with through software. And that's how those ads are going to be delivered on those different channels. It might not even be host read ads, whereas you have local podcasters who have successfully secured advertising and sponsor relationships by going direct. So my advice for local podcasters would be to listen not only to the people who are placing commercials inside sports or just radio in general, because they have money to spend if they're putting an ad or commercial on that particular station. But then in addition to that, if they are sponsoring a podcast feed or a podcast show that's, a lot of times, this is getting into the weeds a little bit, but a lot of the times, especially with 1010, they'll take all of their shows and put them on one podcast feed. So you don't have that individual show that is getting their own individual ads. And so if I'm a podcaster, I'm listening to whoever is sponsoring that entire feed or individual shows. They already have been sold the value on podcasting, and so they got money to spend. And so I'm going to go after them and say, hey, you can reach the same exact audience and I can work directly with you. And so that was one that I disagreed with, because he's talking from a big company, a big VC lens. But that's also the point, I think, of the or a side benefit of the podcast network is that the way that they're able to sell the value of that network is because they have all the shows under one roof. They have all the data under one roof. They have all the analytics under one roof. And so they can sell the value of that entire network versus one show that maybe, gets 40, 50 plays on an episode. It's just a completely different monetization strategy. So his last point is podcasts still don't plug into the internet pipes that well. That's the reason why I would say pay attention as a local podcaster to listen to whoever is already advertising on those local podcast channels, because they have already been sold the value of podcast advertising. They've already believe in it. They're probably already getting metrics around it. So you don't have to do the hard part of selling the value of a podcast sponsorship. That's already built in there. But you can go in and you can say, hey, you can take advantage of this same strategy just with my specific podcast, and you can support local. And so I think that would be my angle that I would take with it, because he kind of has a little bit of like a doomer approach to it, that a local sports podcast could not work at all, and I would disagree with that. I think you need to change up your strategy though, and not join a podcast network like an SB Nation that's going to be VC funded, because their business model is completely different. They only want to see up and to the right as far as growth is concerned. At any time that there's a cutback on that spending, then they're going to cut the first things that they see, and typically that's on the marketing side and on the creator side of things. And so just a few points to kind of keep in mind, that, you know, even though it's a little bit doomerism of what he was talking about here, I do think that there are some pros and cons to joining a network that needs to be considered.
So I guess in summation, as a recap, what would you say are the most obvious pros? Because the ones that come to my mind is kind of like power and numbers, access to resources, specifically like maybe marketing resources, writers, and, social media help. What's another pro that you can think of?
I would say that the initial
affiliation, I guess, too, like affiliation with a brand might be helpful too.
Yeah. So you essentially that built-in distribution. Depending on the size of the network, if they're just starting out or if they're already established, you could have access to their already built-in distribution. So meaning your podcast is getting additional eyeballs on it that you wouldn't be able to achieve if it was just you working independently. That was one of the bigger perks of going into radio, is that people who had never heard of my website and my content related to sports, instantly now I'm recognizable because I'm in their built-in distribution. Now, another thing too that it's not monetary, but it makes you feel good, is that somebody else notices you. A bigger company notices you. And that's really hard to turn down, because as a podcaster, it's a slow burn. It takes a long time to grow a show. It's a lot of hard work. You have to sacrifice a lot of things in order to have a decent amount of growth. And then somebody else comes along and notices your hard work and says, hey, we want to help make things easier for you. It's a pitch that, a lot of people I don't want to say fall for, but a lot of people buy into, because it's not just somebody else noticing your hard work, but it's also, you now have access to a community of other people, of other podcasters that are doing the same thing as you. You can learn faster from them. You may have access to additional editors. You obviously have access to a sales team that's going to be selling your podcast as part of a group, probably not independently, but they're going to be selling it as a group. And so it feels like you've kind of made it. And I think that that's a pro that is often overlooked. And it feels good. And I think it feels good to, put in all that hard work and have somebody else notice it and want to, quote unquote, invest in you. But is that the right path? I could go through some of those cons as well. But I would say the community aspect of it, having access to additional resources, but then also just the ego boost that you get, that somebody else noticed my hard work.
Yeah. And I mean, depending on the network itself, I think there's a lot of power in affiliation and being one step, closer to a listener that might give your show a shot, right? Like if we were on a network, maybe the same listeners that are like, oh, I love Blythe's show. I see that, Badr's got a show on the same network, and I like comics. Let me give that let me check that out. So I think affiliation, I guess you could roll that up underneath community, but I think affiliation is a key one too. In terms of the cons, it sounds like we are in agreement that, you're putting yourself in a position to, in a very worst case scenario, I think in this SB Nation is a worst case scenario where you could lose it all. If the network is not doing so well, or if the owners decide to pull the plug and you've got a contract in place where, you've given up those rights, such as rights, the right to your RSS feed, you could lose it all with no warning, with little to no warning, which I think is an extreme red flag and one to like really think about. I have not been in a position where I've ever went further than like just an email or checking out the potential network. I've kind of stopped short there. So I don't really know, or I can't speak to what a typical podcast network contract is. I can only go by anecdotes that I've heard and, secondhand accounts. But for the most part, if they're going to provide you, assistance in marketing, editing, social media awareness, and, boost put your posts and things like that, they want to cut, let's be real. I mean, this thread that Kyle, and for the record, I'll have a link to this thread that we've been referencing for the past 30 minutes in the show notes. But I just had a brain fire. I forgot where I was going with that. But I think what I was trying to get to is that, the margins for profit in podcasting, especially sales, is very. It sounds very thin in all the cases that I've read, which is anecdotal in itself. But these companies are going to want to make up for that. They've got to profit big time. So your share might be a fraction of what you could be making on your own. But I guess that's the trade-off, right? Is like, do you want it a little easier and you just make a little bit of money, or do you want to do way more work and get a bigger piece of the pie? What other cons do you come to mind for you when you think networking?
Oh, I think that the biggest con for me is that you don't have the independent value, and that I think that's why most of us get started with a podcast, is that you have your own independent voice, your own independent channel, and when you relinquish that to someone else, especially when it comes to ads, you're not going to have any approval on those ads. They're selling it as a group. And if you want to be part of that network, you're going to put that ad for Casper Mattress on your podcast, even if you don't give a shit about Casper mattresses or HelloFresh or whoever else is advertising. Typically these are all group bundled deals. You also don't have access to start your own Patreon, to start your own maybe membership subscription model. If they tell you to put an ad on your podcast, you probably got to do it. If they shut down, you're shit out of luck. And so there's these different variables that you don't recognize that it's a problem until you're already in it and it's already too late.
Until shit hits the fan.
Right. And I did make up a list of questions that, because I do think that, the community aspect matters. I think having the help also really matters to a lot of people too. And so, and also the notoriety, especially if you're part of a bigger platform that will allow you to have additional distribution, you have to weigh those pros and cons. Now, if you find yourself in a situation like this, I do have some questions that you should be asking that network. And so the first one is, you want to ask about your rev share. What is your rev share of any potential ad that comes in? And is that your sole rev share of that ad that comes in, or do you have to split it based on audience demographics, downloads? We've talked in a previous episode how download numbers are skewed. So what if you are on a platform that somebody else is gaming the system and they're going to get all of the ad rev share? That's a problem. So you want to make sure that you have that clearly outlined and defined. Also, you want to know how that network makes money. Are they VC funded? SB Nation was VC funded. When that money starts to dry up even a smidge, you're going to be cut. And so you want to know where that money is coming from. Otherwise, the lights are going to be shut off and you're going to not have access to your RSS feed, because when things shut off, they shut off quick, especially if it's a VC-funded business. So you want to make sure that you understand how that company makes money. If they're in it for the long haul, they can probably promise you the moon and the stars, but you need to be able to see some kind of financials that are a little bit reassuring. And that's probably not something that you can request as a podcaster. And let me see your P&L. But it is something that you want to understand from day one. Are they profitable, or is this something that investors are funding a lot of money into, and that money has a limited runway? That's what you want to try to avoid, is going the VC funded route. Now, if this is a podcast network that has been around for a while, then they're probably already profitable, and they're trying to bring you and your audience under under their wing. That's a conversation that I would entertain. But if it's a VC funded model, I'd turn the other way. I probably wouldn't even respond to the email. So understand how that network is already making money or funding the business. The next is who owns the content and the channels. So ask if you're able to keep the raw copies of the files. So even if you have to hand over your RSS feed, there's companies like Megaphone that, you don't necessarily have to hand over your RSS feed anymore. You can just plug your feed into a platform like Megaphone where they can still have the network can still have all the benefits of seeing the data and the analytics and things like that to do their job and go sell. But you want to make sure that you are able to keep your content in some way, shape, or form. These SB Nation, all of these podcasters apparently are getting paid until the end of April. So we are recording this on April 12th. If I am those podcasters, I'm going in and I'm downloading every single copy of my content from them, every single thing that I've ever written. I am downloading all of it. And so I have a copy of it, even if it's the raw files, because then you can, depending on your contract, you can start up.
I was just about to say, even if you download those episodes, if you don't own that, you can't repost it. And I think it just goes to your point about being very aware of who owns the content. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you have this on your list. Hopefully I'm not jumping too ahead, but it made me think, actually, I did have a case where I did entertain having one meeting about a network, and I cut it short as soon as they said, yeah, we need you to migrate your RSS feed over to our platform. And that was a no-go for me, because it meant that it was like moving it from, Buzzsprout, which I'm accustomed to, I know in and out, to a platform I'm unfamiliar with that I don't know if they were going to give me like my own login and things, but that was kind of like a red flag that if they wanted to move my RSS feed, that's just another layer of complication. If maybe I want to, quit the network or move on, that's something I'd have to account for. So yeah.
Well, it's definitely that is something to keep in mind, and you want to. And in my experience, all of the companies that I've worked with, media-wise, that was something that I arranged from the jump. That if I'm going to come and do a show for you, or if I'm going to come and work on a show, I want a copy of the content. 9 times out of 10, they shared it with me. Even the radio station, even 1010, at the end of the night, they would give me a USB drive. The producer that was responsible for, producing the show, he would give me a USB file and it would have the full show on it. I would take it back home. I would edit out the local commercials, and then I would upload it as its own individual show to my own podcast channel. Helmets and Heels, which is now, congratulations to them, which is now a daily Monday through Friday sports show on 1010. Helmets and Heels was the first podcast out of all 1010, and it was because I set it up. And we were the only show that had a podcast because I believed in it that much. And so that was the way that they would do the content exchange at that point, is they would just give me a USB file. Nowadays, I can just go in and, download a YouTube video or things like that and make it super easy. But I always prefaced any kind of, even when I go and do other interviews, I ask for permission, or a big reason of why I say yes to doing interviews so much is that I can use the content afterwards. And so then I will go back through, I'll get a copy of that file, I'll edit it, add my own intro, and then I'll upload it to my own channels. And so making sure that you can have a copy of the files, or asking the question of who owns the files. Those are very, very important. If you have a copy of the files and you're able to use them, then a lot of these folks over at SB Nation wouldn't be facing the same issue. But I would be willing to bet that a big VC-funded company like SB Nation probably have some stipulations in their contract that you can't go and use that content for, unpermissible reasons. So always keep a backup file of your content. I don't care who you are working for, not a link, not any of that garbage, because I've made that mistake too, where I kept little links of where all my content was. Well, turns out the company shuts down, and then you don't have access to those links anymore.
You got to take it back old school.
Yes,
you got to get them MP3 files up,
or MP4, whichever the platform that you are working with. Make sure that you have an access to that content, and you can keep access to those files. There are some benefits to joining a podcast network. I know with being in logistics now, there is another podcaster who He does fantastic numbers. I mean, I'm talking about hundreds of thousands of people are subscribed to his content. He has content that gets millions of views. He actually is part of, an advertising agency now that plugs into his show via megaphone, so they get all the audience analytics, but he's still facing challenges because he thought that he was going to be able to offload his ad sales to them. He feels like he really made it and he's owning all the content, he's doing all the right things. Well, it turns out this ad agency just doesn't have the right chops to sell his kind of content, and he's still having to be involved in all of the sales meetings. And so his mindset is, and we've had conversations about that, that's why I know this, but his mindset is, well, why am I sitting in on these conversations? Because you were supposed to take this off my plate. You were supposed to do this for me, that it would help me free up time so I can go and focus on making better content. And now you're getting a cut of my money that I'm still having to do all the same work. And so that's just, I don't know really the longevity of podcast networks. I was part of a blogging one, and I will say for that period of time, it was valuable to have other bloggers to lean on, and we would all share each other's content, and that to me was the best part of being in a network, is that I was being exposed to their audiences as well, and there was almost this motivation to share each other's content. But I think it just comes back to there are ways to do the benefits of a podcast network without giving up your content, and I think that should be things that we explore more often. So I think that's also a perfect sort of opportunity to shout out some of our Jack's Podcaster series that we've been dropping over on YouTube. Dropping gems like that where you're genuinely showcasing people within your network in a different, unique way, I think is the way to go, because you have all the added benefits of the community, of being able to ask each other questions and getting access to their audience and distribution. But we don't charge anybody anything to do that.
Like a bunch of suckers. You guys get it for free. No, we do it for the love of the community.
And we have other monetization goals in the future that don't involve that. But there are certain benefits to the podcaster network. But the cons are just far outweigh them. And when somebody like an SB Nation goes down, I just struggle to think that is a model that will work in the future.
I'll add one more thing in here, and I want to shift topics because you brought up the JPU. So our next topic that I'm pitching up is all about that. But I get a similar. I have a similar reaction when I see these headlines where it's kind of like a double-edged sword. The pessimistic side of me is like, man, it just highlights how difficult it is to monetize in podcasting, especially as a solo podcaster, the small-time, solo single podcaster. And you read a story like this and you're like, man, how am I supposed to stand out when a network with, I'm sure it's not hundreds, but whatever, just roll it with hundreds. Of pod. Yeah. Oh, it is hundreds. Okay. Wow. That makes the story even worse. I don't know if it's hundreds, but
it was a long delay layoff. So it was, sure. They had some rounds.
You said
of
it was 2 waves. Got it. So, but you see a headline like this, and as a solo independent podcast, you're like, man, how am I supposed to compete when a network is failing to monetize?
Because they're advertising Casper mattresses, things that don't necessarily make sense for your podcast.
And totally agree. I think that's the power, a pro of being an independent podcast. You have a lot more control of what ads you play and how you go about monetizing. And I go back to the Kyle's thread. He highlights, I guess you can look at it like, okay, networks are failing. What chance do I have? But then in the same regard, I look through like Kyle's thread where he highlights some of the possible issues that SB Nation was having, where these are problems that an independent podcaster is facing, which is he mentions. Every one of these ad deals required proof of performance. in-person events, actual sales, or referrals. And I think when we think of podcasting, setting up a deal or a sponsor, that is what they're going to be looking for, is some sort of proof of performance, whether that be download numbers, did people use the referral code. I thought the in-person events is interesting. As someone that's done a couple of live events, I've always gravitated towards that, because to me, a butt in the chair is worth 10 downloads. But the fact that a giant network is having to navigate that as well, it kind of paints that, sure, podcasting is very nuanced, but I think there's a lot of core issues that, whether you're a network, a giant podcaster, you're going to face, or a small podcaster, you're going to face, like proof of performance. How do you convince a sponsor to stay with you, considering how easy it is to manipulate downloads and how difficult it can be to get an accurate number? I think seeing a story like this as an independent podcaster, you can relate to the problems they were having. And I think the benefit is that you're not at that large scale where it's like, you have to move in consideration with a bunch of other folks. Like, you can move a lot more agile as a solo podcaster. So I saw that to say that, this kind of comes off a little bit as gloom and doom, but I think there are a lot of lessons you could learn as an independent podcaster who's got, control of everything. You're going to have to put in, obviously, a lot more work in there, but I think there's definitely some lessons to glean from this.
One last tip, just for folks that are maybe looking to monetize their show in the future. Start a compliments folder where anytime someone compliments an episode, you take a screenshot of it and you save it to a specific album, or you add it to maybe someone sends you a compliment on an email or something like that. Have a system where you save those content compliments, because that will go so far as proving the value of your show when this, tomfoolery exists in downloads. And, bots are estimated to be over 50%, or spam bot traffic is estimated to be over 50% of all internet traffic, downloads, views, watches, whatever, you name it. So having a highly engaged audience that is listening regularly and complimenting your content, have a system that you are taking screenshots of that and taking screenshots of your analytics. So then that way, when people ask, they're going to eventually ask for podcast downloads and metrics and things like that. But you can position it in a way that you are also showing legitimate and real interaction with your show. And so that's the one, I guess, sort of final takeaway is that if you're monetizing your show right now, or you're thinking about it in the future, which most shows are, start that process now, and then just build the muscle memory of taking that screenshot and saving it in a particular place. And so that when you are ready to monetize, you can hopefully have dozens of these content compliments that you can then show to a potential sponsor to show, sort of to sort of counteract the Kyle's point about, live audiences. And you need to be able to have people come to live events and things like that. You know how many shows we did at restaurants where nobody cared? Nobody paid attention to us. We're just broadcasting off to the side. Didn't even have no speaker for people to listen to live. Like, live. The way you guys did live shows with Shortbox was the smart way to go. The way that most live shows are done by sports podcasts are not.
Yeah, that's fair. Well said. All right, and this is where this clip ends, and we move on to our second topic. So if you're watching on YouTube, check out the second clip from this episode. If you're listening to the audio version, we're going to keep it moving.